Welcome to The Explainer. So let's talk about India's 2025 monsoon parliamentary session. It was, well, a story of two completely different realities happening at the same time. On one hand, you had these massive, headline-grabbing protests, but on the other, a surprising number of big new laws actually got passed. So the question is, how did so much get done in the middle of all that chaos? Let's break it down.
And that's really the big question here, isn't it? Was this session a success because it pushed through major reforms, or was it a total failure, basically shut down by all the protests? As you're about to see, the answer isn't so simple. The truth is, it was both.
So you had the government on one side, laser-focused on its legislative agenda, trying to pass these huge new reforms. And then on the other side, you had the opposition, who were absolutely determined to get answers on some pretty explosive allegations. This led to daily standoffs and really fierce debates that, honestly, often shut the whole place down.
Okay, first things first, let's get our timeline straight. The session kicked off on July 21st. Now, it was scheduled to have 21 sittings, but it actually ended up wrapping early on August 12th. So, what on earth happened in that short and very, very intense period?
All right, so let's start with one side of that coin, the order. Despite what felt like a constant background noise of shouting and protests, a really surprising amount of legislative work actually got done. 8. Yeah, 8. That's the number of major bills that Parliament managed to pass into law. And this is with all the walkouts, the adjournments, you name it. This legislative push is a really critical part of the whole story.
And listen, we're not talking about minor tweaks here. The income tax bill, for example, is set to completely overhaul how millions of us file our taxes. And the national sports bill? That could directly affect India's hunt for Olympic medals by changing how our sports are run. This is really significant stuff.
Okay, so if all that important work was getting done, where does all this talk of chaos come from? Well, for all the lawmaking that was happening, the session was just as much defined by protests that literally brought Parliament to a grinding halt.
The opposition's protests really boiled down to a few key flashpoints. They were demanding an investigation into something called the Bihar State Intelligence Report and these related vote chory allegations of election fraud. They also went after the government on national security and foreign policy. It all led to what everyone started calling a washout of entire days.
And just to give you an idea of how intense this got, the whole vote chory or vote theft controversy basically took over the session from day one. There were allegations of major issues with Bihar's voter lists, and the whole thing was symbolized by this one bizarre case of a 124-year-old first-time voter. That became a huge rallying cry for the opposition.
And this quote, wow, it perfectly captures the political theater of it all. During a heated debate about U.S. tariffs, Rahul Gandhi challenged Prime Minister Modi directly on the floor. And this line, describing the PM's quiet response, it went viral. It just summed up the really confrontational mood of the entire session.
Now, when it came to national security, the government fought back. Hard. There was this fierce, two-day-long debate over a controversial counterterrorism mission called Operation Sindoor. And in response to the criticism, the Home Minister gave this really forceful defense, making the administration's tough stance crystal clear.
And you know, it wasn't just a two-way fight between the government and the main opposition. Other influential voices jumped into the fray, with members like Asaduddin Owaisi questioning the government's entire foreign policy approach, especially when it came to relations with Pakistan.
So, you've got these two totally opposite stories. Major laws getting passed, but also total chaos. So what happens when we look at the actual numbers? You know, how did Parliament really spend its time? Well, the data tells a fascinating story.
And that really brings us right back to the core contradiction here. You can only describe this session as one of major wins for the government's agenda that happened right alongside repeated washouts from protests. Both of these things are completely true.
Get this, a staggering 60% of the session's time gone. Lost to disruptions and adjournments. Just think about that for a second. For every 2 hours that were spent on actual productive work, 3 hours were lost to protests and standstills.
Okay, let's take a step back from all the parliamentary drama for a second and ask the big question, why does any of this actually matter to you and me? Why should we care about what happened during this wild session?
At the end of the day, this session really leaves behind two very different legacies. On one hand, the order side gave us real concrete laws that could make your taxes simpler and maybe even boost Indian sports. But on the other hand, the chaos side exposed these really deep, unresolved divides on fundamental issues like election integrity and national security.
things that are at the very core of a democracy. And all of this really pushes us to ask a pretty fundamental question about how democracy is supposed to work. Protest is an absolutely vital right. Of course it is. But where do you draw the line between holding power to account and completely paralyzing the very institution that's meant to serve the people? That's the big question the 2025 monsoon session leaves hanging in the air.